Some places do not forget what happened inside them. Long after the people are gone, the land remembers the fear, the silence, and the moment when obedience finally broke. Before we descend into what happened in the Carolina Low Country during the autumn of 1857, I need you to understand something about silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that becomes a language. The kind that fills rooms where people have learned that speaking costs more than they can afford. This is a story built on that silence. It began in a place where moss hung from trees like funeral cloth, where the air itself felt thick with memory, and where a single house stood at the end of a long road lined with ancient oaks. The house was called Bellmeyer. It was not grand by the standards of its time, but it was substantial. 2 stories of whitewashed wood, shutters painted green, a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the eastern side. The property covered 300 acres, most of it worked fields, some of it swamp. At the time of these events, 11 enslaved people lived on the property, housed in a row of cabins behind the main house. The nearest neighbors were 2 miles away. The nearest town, Ashford, was 5 miles down a road that became impassable when it rained. Isolation was not unusual for properties like this, but Bellmeyer had a reputation. People in Ashford did not speak of it often, but when they did, they lowered their voices. There were rumors about the man who owned it, rumors about what happened to people who crossed him, rumors about sounds that traveled across the fields at night. The owner's name was Nathaniel Grayson. He was 53 years old in 1857, a widower who had remarried 4 years earlier. And there was a man named Elias, who had been brought to Bellmeyer in chains 6 years before. What happened between these 3 people was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, across months, in whispers and glances and decisions made in the dark. By the time it reached its conclusion, the silence that had protected them would be broken, and the truth would spill out in ways none of them could have predicted. This is not a story about heroes. It is a story about survival, about what people become when they are trapped, and about the terrible clarity that comes when there is no other way out. Nathaniel Grayson was not born cruel, but cruelty had grown in him like a vine, slow and persistent, until it choked out whatever softness he might have once possessed. His first wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth in 1851, along with the child. After that, something in Nathaniel changed. He became quieter, more withdrawn, but also more volatile. His temper, which had always been short, became unpredictable. The enslaved people on the property learned to read his moods by the way he walked, by the set of his jaw, by whether he carried his walking stick or left it leaning by the door. The stick was made of dark wood, polished smooth from use, and it had a brass handle shaped like a clenched fist. When Nathaniel carried it, everyone knew to stay out of his way. He used it for more than walking. He used it to enforce obedience, to remind people of their place, to settle disputes that were not really disputes at all, but assertions of his will. The enslaved people called it the judge, because when Nathaniel brought it down on someone, there was no appeal. By the time Catherine arrived at Bellmeyer, Nathaniel's reputation in Ashford was already fixed. He was known as a difficult man, one who did not tolerate insubordination or inefficiency. He was also known as a man who kept to himself, who rarely attended social gatherings, and who had grown increasingly isolated after Margaret's death. The marriage to Catherine had been arranged through intermediaries, much like a business transaction. Her family, struggling financially after a series of poor investments, had seen the arrangement as a solution. Nathaniel, in turn, had wanted a wife to manage the household and eventually produce an heir. There was no romance in the arrangement. It was pragmatic, transactional, and understood by both parties to be so. Catherine Grayson had arrived at Bellmeyer in the spring of 1853, accompanied by a single trunk of belongings and a sense of resignation so complete it felt like drowning. She was not naive about what she was entering into. Her mother had explained, in careful, measured terms, that marriage was not about happiness, but about security, about duty, about making the best of circumstances that were often less than ideal. Catherine had nodded and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She had met Nathaniel only twice before the wedding, both times in the presence of her family. He had been polite, formal, and distant. He had asked her a few questions about her education, her ability to manage a household, her health. She had answered dutifully. There had been no warmth in the exchange, no attempt to know her as a person. She was being evaluated, not courted. The wedding had been small, held in Ashford, attended by a handful of family members and a few of Nathaniel's business associates. Afterward, they had traveled to Belmire in a carriage that rattled over uneven roads. Catherine had looked out the window at the landscape passing by, fields, forests, marshland, and felt as though she were being carried toward the edge of the world. When they arrived at the house, Nathaniel had shown her through the rooms with the same detachment he might have used to show a potential buyer. This is the parlor. This is the dining room. This is the library. Upstairs are the bedrooms. Yours is the second door on the left. He had not said, our bedroom. He had said, yours. And that night, Catherine had understood what kind of marriage this would be. Nathaniel came to her room occasionally, when he wanted to, and left when he was finished. He did not speak to her during these visits. He did not look at her face. She learned to lie still, to breathe shallowly, to let her mind go somewhere else. Afterward, he would return to his own room, and she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. In the months that followed, Catherine tried to find ways to occupy herself. She took over the management of the household, overseeing meals, directing the work of the enslaved women who cleaned and cooked. She tried to make the house feel less oppressive, less like a mausoleum, but her efforts were met with indifference from Nathaniel. He did not care whether the curtains were changed or the parlor rearranged. He spent most of his time in the library or walking the property, inspecting the fields, watching the work being done. Catherine learned quickly that her role was not to be a companion or even a partner, but to be invisible, except when needed. Elias had come to Belmire in the winter of 1851, purchased at an auction in Charleston for $800. He had been 24 years old, tall and strong, with a quiet intensity that had made Nathaniel decide he was worth the price. Elias had been born enslaved on a plantation in Virginia, but had been sold twice before ending up in Charleston. Each sale had taken him farther from anything resembling home, until the word itself had lost meaning. At Belmire, Elias was assigned to field work, primarily clearing land and maintaining the property's irrigation ditches. It was brutal labor, especially in the summer heat, but Elias was good at it. He worked steadily, without complaint, and kept to himself. The other enslaved people on the property respected him, but did not know him well. He did not socialize much, did not join in conversations around the fire in the evenings. He seemed to carry something heavy inside him, something that made him prefer solitude. Nathaniel noticed Elias because Elias was competent. Unlike some of the others who needed constant supervision, Elias understood instructions quickly and executed them without error. This made him useful, but it also made Nathaniel wary. Competence could be a form of defiance, if not properly controlled. Nathaniel began assigning Elias tasks that required more skill, repairing fences, tending to the horses, maintaining the tools. He watched Elias carefully during these tasks, looking for signs of arrogance or insubordination. He found none. Elias worked with the same quiet focus regardless of the task. But there was something in his eyes, something that Nathaniel could not quite name, that unsettled him. It was not defiance exactly, but it was not submission either. It was a kind of internal reserve, a sense that Elias was present but also absent, that he was doing what was required while keeping some part of himself unreachable. This bothered Nathaniel more than outright resistance would have. Resistance could be punished. But this quiet withdrawal, this refusal to be fully broken, was harder to address. Over time, Nathaniel's discomfort with Elias grew into something darker. He began looking for reasons to punish him, small infractions that could justify discipline. A tool left in the wrong place, a task completed slightly later than expected. Nathaniel would use these moments to assert control, to remind Elias of his position. He would strike him with the walking stick, or withhold food, or assign extra labor. Elias endured these punishments without protest, which only deepened Nathaniel's frustration. Catherine first became aware of Elias in the summer of 1854, more than a year after her arrival at Belmire. She had seen him before, of course. It was impossible not to notice the people who worked the property, but she had not really looked at him. He was simply one of the figures moving through the fields, one of the men whose labor kept the estate functioning. But one afternoon, as she stood on the porch with a cup of tea, she watched him working near the house, repairing a section of fence that had collapsed during a storm. He worked methodically, measuring each board before cutting, fitting the pieces together with precision. There was a grace to his movements, a quiet confidence that stood in contrast to the brute force she had come to associate with the work done on the property. She found herself watching him longer than she intended. And then, as if sensing her gaze, he looked up. Their eyes met for only a moment before he looked away and returned to his work. But in that brief exchange, something shifted. Catherine felt it, though she could not have named it. It was not attraction, not yet. It was recognition, a sense that she had seen something in him that was not supposed to be visible, that he was not simply a laborer, not simply property, but a person with thoughts and feelings that existed beyond the role he was forced to play. The realization unsettled her. She went back inside and tried to dismiss it, but the image of his face stayed with her. Over the following weeks, she found herself looking for him, not deliberately, but her gaze seemed to find him on its own. She noticed things she had not noticed before, the way he paused sometimes to look at the sky, the way he spoke to the other enslaved people with a kind of quiet authority, the way he carried himself, even under the weight of exhaustion, with a dignity that should not have been possible in his circumstances. Catherine told herself that her interest was academic, that she was simply observing the people who lived on the property. But she knew, on some level, that this was not true. There was something about Elias that pulled at her, something that made her feel less alone in her own captivity, because that was how she had come to think of her life at Belmire, as a form of captivity, different in degree, but not in kind from the bondage of the people who worked the fields. The first time Catherine and Elias spoke, it was by accident. She had been walking near the barn in the late afternoon, trying to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house, when she heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She followed it and found Elias inside the barn, working on a saddle that had torn. He was seated on a low stool, his hands moving carefully over the leather, stitching it with a needle and thread. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Catherine said quietly, "You do that well." Elias hesitated, as though trying to determine whether she was speaking to him or simply making an observation aloud. Then he said, "Thank you, ma'am." His voice was low, steady, and there was something in it that made Catherine want to keep talking, to prolong the moment. She asked him where he had learned to repair leather, and he explained that he had been taught by a saddler on a previous plantation. The conversation was brief, no more than a few minutes, but it stayed with Catherine long after she returned to the house. That night, lying in bed, she replayed the exchange in her mind. She thought about the way he had looked at her, not with fear or deference, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as though they were equals, if only for a moment. It was a dangerous thought, and she knew it, but she could not let it go. Over the following months, Catherine found more opportunities to speak with Elias. She would ask him questions about his work, about the property, about small, inconsequential things. The conversations were always brief, always conducted in places where they were unlikely to be seen by Nathaniel or anyone else who might report back to him. But they became the parts of Catherine's day that she looked forward to most. Elias, for his part, seemed to understand the risk they were taking, but he did not pull away. He answered her questions,
asked a few of his own, and gradually, the wall between them began to crumble. They began to share more than words. Catherine brought him food sometimes, small amounts that would not be missed from the kitchen. Elias, in turn, began to tell her things.
Small stories about his life before Bellmeyer, memories of his mother, fragments of a past that he had thought was lost. These exchanges were not romantic, not in the conventional sense. They were something deeper and more essential. They were a recognition of each other's humanity in a place where humanity was systematically denied. By the winter of 1856, Catherine and Elias had developed a language of their own, made up of glances, gestures, and carefully chosen words. They met in the barn late at night, when the rest of the property was asleep, when the risk of discovery was lowest. These meetings were stolen moments, fragile and dangerous, but they were the only times when Catherine felt truly alive. It was during one of these meetings that the nature of their relationship changed. They had been sitting in the barn, talking quietly, when Catherine reached out and touched Elias's hand. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious, but it carried the weight of everything they had not said. Elias looked at her, and she saw in his eyes the same longing, the same need that she felt. They did not speak. They did not need to. What followed was not a decision so much as a surrender, a recognition that they had already crossed a line from which there was no return. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Catherine felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She knew what they had done was unforgivable in the eyes of the world they lived in. If Nathaniel discovered the truth, he would kill Elias without hesitation, and Catherine's fate would be little better. But in that moment, none of it mattered. For the first time since arriving at Bellmeyer, she felt something other than despair. She felt hope. Elias, too, seemed transformed. The quiet reserve that had always defined him gave way to something softer, more open. He spoke to her about his dreams, about a life that could exist beyond the boundaries of the plantation, beyond the system that had enslaved him. He spoke about freedom, not as an abstract concept, but as something tangible, something they could reach if they were brave enough. Catherine listened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that another life was possible. But hope in a place like Bellmeyer was a dangerous thing. It made people careless, made them forget the watchful eyes that surrounded them, the systems of control that operated even in the quietest corners. In the early months of 1857, Catherine and Elias continued their meetings, but the risk of discovery grew. One of the other enslaved women, a woman named Dinah, began to notice Catherine's absences from the house, the way she would slip out late at night and return before dawn. Dinah said nothing, but Catherine could feel her suspicion like a weight. Nathaniel, too, seemed more alert, more attuned to the rhythms of the property. He began asking Catherine questions about how she spent her days, what she did when he was away. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, a suggestion of surveillance. Catherine deflected his questions as best she could, but she knew that time was running out. It was in March of 1857 that Catherine discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly, a creeping awareness that her body was changing in ways she could not ignore. At first, she tried to deny it, to convince herself that she was mistaken. But as the weeks passed, the truth became undeniable. The child could not be Nathaniel's. He had not come to her room in months, and even when he had, the encounters had been infrequent and perfunctory. The child was Elias's, and that fact put them both in mortal danger. Catherine told Elias the night she was certain. They were in the barn, and when she spoke the words, she saw the fear flash across his face, followed by something else, a grim determination. He understood, as she did, that there was no way forward that did not involve unspeakable risk. If the pregnancy became visible, Nathaniel would know. He would see the child's features, would realize the truth, and he would exact a punishment that would destroy them both. They could not run. Nathaniel had connections throughout the region, resources that would make it almost impossible for them to escape. Even if they managed to leave the property, they would be hunted, captured, and brought back. and Elias, as an enslaved man, would face a fate far worse than death. There was only one option, and both of them knew it, though neither wanted to say it aloud. Nathaniel had to die. The decision was not made in a single moment. It unfolded over weeks, through whispered conversations and long silences in which they both grappled with what they were about to do. Catherine understood that killing Nathaniel would make her a murderer, would place her outside the boundaries of law and morality. But she also understood that staying silent, doing nothing, would result in her death and Elias's death, and the death of the child she carried. There was no moral high ground, no choice that did not involve blood. Elias was even more tormented by the decision. He had spent his entire life navigating a world where violence against him was routine, expected, justified. To strike back, to take a life, would invert the order of things in a way that felt both liberating and terrifying. But when he looked at Catherine, when he thought about the child, he knew he would do whatever was necessary. They began to plan. Catherine, who had spent years observing Nathaniel's habits, knew his routines better than anyone. She knew when he drank, how much he drank, when he was most vulnerable. She knew that he often spent his evenings in the library, drinking whiskey and reading newspapers, and that he became drowsy after several glasses. She also knew that Nathaniel kept a pistol in the library, in a drawer of his desk, loaded and ready in case of intruders. It was this pistol that would be the instrument of his death. Catherine and Elias discussed various methods. Poison was considered but rejected. It was too slow, too uncertain, and too likely to leave evidence. A staged accident was also discussed, but they could not find a scenario that would be convincing. In the end, they settled on something more direct. Catherine would retrieve the pistol from the desk, and Elias would use it to shoot Nathaniel while he slept. It would be quick, final, and if they were careful, it could be made to look like a robbery gone wrong. The plan required precise timing and absolute secrecy. They chose a night in late September, when Nathaniel was scheduled to be alone in the house. Catherine had arranged for the enslaved women who usually cleaned the house to be occupied with other tasks, ensuring that no one would be nearby to hear the gunshot. She also made sure that the other enslaved men on the property were working in distant fields, far enough away that they could claim ignorance of what happened. The night of September 28, 1857 was humid and moonless. Catherine moved through the house with a calmness that surprised her. She had expected to feel panic, to lose her nerve, but instead she felt a cold clarity. She waited until Nathaniel had finished his third glass of whiskey and had settled into his chair in the library, his head tilted back, his breathing heavy. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, and felt nothing. No pity, no regret, no hesitation. He had made her life unbearable, had treated her as property, had created a prison from which there was no escape except this. She walked to the desk and opened the drawer. The pistol was there, heavy and cold. She picked it up, checked that it was loaded, and carried it out of the library. Nathaniel did not stir. She met Elias near the barn, handed him the pistol, and together they returned to the house. Elias entered through the back door, moving silently through the hallway, up the stairs, to Nathaniel's bedroom. Catherine waited downstairs, her heart pounding, listening. The minutes stretched into eternity. And then, the shot. A single sharp crack that split the silence of the house. Catherine flinched, but she did not move. She waited, counting her breaths, until Elias appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale, the pistol still in his hand. He descended slowly, and when he reached her, he said quietly, "It's done." They stood together in the darkness, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Catherine took the pistol from him and returned it to the desk drawer in the library, wiping it clean of fingerprints. They had agreed that the pistol had to be found in its usual place to avoid suspicion. They also agreed that Elias would return to his cabin and act as though nothing had happened. Catherine, meanwhile, would wait until morning to discover Nathaniel's body and raise the alarm. It was a simple plan, and if it worked, they would have a chance at survival. But plans, no matter how carefully constructed, can unravel in unexpected ways. The first indication that something was wrong came the following morning, when Catherine went upstairs to Nathaniel's room and found not just his body, but evidence that someone had been in the room after the shooting. A window was open, one that had been closed the night before. A muddy footprint, too large to be Elias's, marked the floor near the bed, and the pistol, which Catherine had returned to the desk, was missing. Panic gripped her. She forced herself to remain calm, to think clearly. Someone had been in the house. Someone had witnessed what happened, or had arrived immediately afterward, and had taken the pistol. The implications were catastrophic. If someone else knew about the murder, they could use that knowledge to blackmail her, to destroy her, or worse, to turn Elias over to the authorities. Catherine raised the alarm as planned, summoning the overseer and sending word to the sheriff in Ashford. She played the role of the grieving widow with a skill that surprised even herself, weeping convincingly, expressing shock and horror at the thought that someone had broken into the house and murdered her husband. The sheriff, a man named Josiah Caldwell, arrived that afternoon. He was methodical in his investigation, examining the body, the room, the house. He questioned Catherine at length, asking about Nathaniel's enemies, about any recent disputes or threats. Catherine told him that Nathaniel had been a difficult man, that he had made enemies, but that she could not think of anyone who would have wanted him dead. Caldwell also questioned the enslaved people on the property, starting with the men who had been working in the fields the night of the murder. They all claimed ignorance, said they had heard nothing, seen nothing. Caldwell did not seem entirely convinced, but he had no evidence to contradict them. It was during the questioning of Elias that Catherine felt the ground begin to shift beneath her. Caldwell asked Elias where he had been the night of the murder, and Elias answered that he had been in his cabin, asleep. Caldwell nodded, seemed satisfied, and then asked if anyone could confirm that. Elias hesitated, just for a moment, and in that hesitation, Caldwell's eyes sharpened. He asked the question again, more slowly, and Elias repeated his answer. But the damage was done. Caldwell had seen the hesitation, had sensed something off. And Catherine knew that the investigation was no longer focused on an unknown intruder. It was focused on Elias. Over the following days, Caldwell's investigation intensified. He returned to Belmire multiple times, re-examining the scene, re-questioning the people who lived and worked there. He was particularly interested in the missing pistol and in the muddy footprint, which he determined had been made by a boot consistent with those worn by enslaved men on the property. He also discovered, through careful questioning, that Elias had been seen near the main house on the night of the murder, despite his claim that he had been in his cabin. The testimony came from Dinah, the woman who had noticed Catherine's absences. Dinah told Caldwell that she had seen Elias walking toward the house around the time the shot was heard, and that she had seen him return to the cabins shortly afterward. She said she had not reported it earlier because she had not thought it was important, but now, with the investigation ongoing, she felt it was her duty to tell the truth. Catherine's heart sank when she heard this. Dinah's testimony was not definitive proof, but it was enough to place Elias at the scene, enough to shift the investigation in a direction that would ultimately lead to his arrest. Caldwell confronted Elias with the testimony, and Elias denied it, but his denials lacked conviction. He was exhausted, afraid, and the weight of what he had done was beginning to crush him. Caldwell, sensing weakness, pressed harder, telling Elias that if he confessed, the court might show leniency, might consider the circumstances. But if he continued to lie, he would be hanged without mercy. Elias said nothing. He looked at Catherine, who was standing in the doorway of the parlor, and in his eyes she saw a silent plea, to save herself, to let him take the blame, to survive. But Catherine could not do that. She stepped forward and said quietly, "He didn't do it alone. I helped him." The room went silent. Caldwell stared at her, trying to determine if she was lying, if she was protecting Elias out of some misguided sense of loyalty. But Catherine's expression was steady, unflinching. She repeated her statement, adding details that only someone involved in the murder could have known. She described how she had retrieved the pistol, how she had given it to Elias, how they had planned the murder together. Caldwell arrested them both. The trial took place in November of 1857 in the courthouse in Ashford. It was a brief affair, lasting only 3 days. The evidence against Catherine and Elias was overwhelming. The testimony of Dinah, the physical evidence from the scene, and Catherine's own confession. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded conspiracy, a plot born of lust and greed, in which a faithless wife and her enslaved lover had murdered an innocent man for their own gain. The defense, such as it was, attempted to argue that Catherine had been coerced, that Elias had manipulated her into participating in the murder. But the argument was unconvincing, and the jury saw through it. Catherine and Elias both testified, and their testimonies revealed a different story. A story of desperation, of love in a place where love was forbidden, of a pregnancy that would have destroyed them both. Catherine spoke about the years of abuse she had endured, about the isolation and despair that had driven her to seek comfort in Elias. Elias spoke about the impossibility of their situation, about the knowledge that there was no future for them unless Nathaniel was removed. The jury listened, but their faces remained impassive. In the society they lived in, none of the reasons Catherine and Elias offered mattered. A wife who murdered her husband and an enslaved man who participated in that murder had committed crimes that could not be excused or mitigated. The verdict was swift, guilty on all counts. The sentencing was equally swift. Elias was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out within the week. Catherine was sentenced to life imprisonment, a concession to her gender and her social standing, but one that offered little comfort. She would spend the rest of her life in a cell, her child would be born in prison, and the life she had imagined with Elias would remain forever out of reach. Elias was hanged on November 19, 1857, in the public square in Ashford. A crowd gathered to watch, as crowds always did for such events. Catherine was not allowed to attend, but she heard about it later from a guard at the prison. The guard told her that Elias had been calm, that he had not fought or pleaded, that he had climbed the scaffold with dignity, and had stood quietly while the noose was placed around his neck. The guard said that just before the trapdoor opened, Elias had looked toward the horizon, as though searching for something, or someone, and then he was gone. Catherine received this news in her cell, alone, and for the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself to weep. She wept not just for Elias, but for the life they had almost had, for the child she carried who would never know his father, for the impossible love that had brought them to this end. The weeks that followed were a blur of grief and numbness. Catherine was transferred to a women's prison in Charleston, where she would serve her sentence. The conditions were harsh, the cells cramped and cold, the food barely sufficient to sustain life. But Catherine endured, because she had no other choice. In February of 1858, she gave birth to a son. The child was taken from her almost immediately, placed in the care of an orphanage. Catherine was allowed to see him only once, for a few minutes, and in that brief meeting she memorized his face, the shape of his eyes, the curve of his mouth. She saw Elias in him, and she felt both sorrow and a strange, defiant pride. The child would never know his parents, would never know the story of how he came to be, but he would exist. He would be proof that their love had been real, that it had created something that could not be erased. Catherine lived for another 12 years in prison. She spent her days in silence, performing the monotonous labor assigned to her, sewing, cleaning, laundering. She spoke to few people, kept to herself, and gradually became a ghostly presence in the prison, noticed only when her absence would have been inconvenient. The other prisoners whispered about her, called her the murderous mistress, speculated about her crime and her motives. But Catherine paid them no attention. She lived inside her own mind, inside memories of the barn at Belmire, of Elias's voice, of the hope she had felt, however briefly, that another life was possible. In 1870, Catherine became ill. The illness began as a cough, then progressed to a fever, and finally to a weakness that left her bedridden. The prison doctor examined her and determined that she had consumption, and that there was nothing to be done. She would die, probably within a few weeks. Catherine received this news with equanimity. She had been waiting for death, in a sense, since the day Elias was hanged. It no longer frightened her. On her final day, Catherine asked the prison chaplain if he could help her write a letter. She was too weak to hold a pen, so she dictated, and he transcribed. The letter was addressed to her son, whose name she did not know, whose location she could only guess at. In the letter, Catherine told him the truth about his origins, about the love that had brought him into being, about the circumstances that had torn his parents apart. She told him that she and Elias had done what they did not out of cruelty, but out of desperation, out of a desire to survive and to protect him. She told him that she hoped he would not judge them too harshly, that he would understand that they had been trapped in a system that offered no mercy, no escape. The chaplain finished writing, folded the letter, and promised to deliver it. Catherine did not know if he would keep that promise, but it no longer mattered. She had spoken her truth, and that was enough. Catherine died that night, alone in her cell. Her body was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave. There was no funeral, no mourning, no acknowledgement of her passing beyond a brief notation in the prison records. The letter Catherine dictated was never delivered. The chaplain, upon reading it more carefully, decided that its contents were too inflammatory, too dangerous, and he destroyed it. He told himself that he was protecting the boy, shielding him from a truth that would only cause pain. But in reality, he was protecting the social order, the narrative that crimes like Catherine's were the result of moral depravity rather than systemic cruelty. The boy grew up in the orphanage, was eventually apprenticed to a tradesman, and lived his life without ever knowing who his parents were or the circumstances of his birth. He married, had children of his own, and died in 1912, an old man who had lived a quiet, unremarkable life. He never knew that his existence was the result of a love so desperate and so dangerous that it had cost his parents everything. The story of Catherine and Elias might have ended there, forgotten, buried under layers of time and silence. But stories like theirs have a way of resurfacing, of slipping through cracks in the official record. In the 1930s, a historian researching the pre-Civil War period in the Carolina Low Country came across Catherine's trial records while examining courthouse archives. The case intrigued him, and he began to dig deeper, looking for additional documents, testimonies, anything that might shed light on what had happened. He found Dinah's testimony, which revealed details that had not been included in the trial transcript. He found letters written by Sheriff Caldwell to his superiors, in which Caldwell expressed his discomfort with the case, his sense that the law had been used to punish people who were themselves victims of a brutal system. He found a diary kept by one of the jurors, who wrote that he had voted to convict but had been troubled by the verdict, had felt that the trial had been less about justice than about maintaining social order. The historian published his findings in a small academic journal in 1938. The article was titled, "Love and Murder in the Antebellum South: The Case of Catherine Grayson and Elias." It was carefully researched, meticulously footnoted, and largely ignored. The few people who read it found it interesting but not particularly significant. It was, they thought, just one more tragic story from a brutal era. But the article did catch the attention of a novelist, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who was looking for material for a book about women who had killed their husbands. Vance read the historian's article and was fascinated. She saw in Catherine's story not just a crime, but a critique of the institution of marriage, of slavery, of the entire social structure that had made such a tragedy inevitable. Vance traveled to South Carolina, visited the site of Belmire, which by then was an overgrown ruin, and walked through the remains of the house and the fields. She stood near the barn where Catherine and Elias had met, and she felt the weight of their story, the way it pressed against the present, demanding to be remembered. Vance wrote her novel, which was published in 1947 under the title The Silent Conspiracy. The book was a fictionalized account of Catherine and Elias's story, with names and some details changed, but the core of the narrative remained intact. The novel was moderately successful, praised for its unflinching portrayal of the violence and hypocrisy of the antebellum South, and criticized by some for its sympathetic treatment of a murderer. Over the decades that followed, the story of Catherine and Elias continued to circulate, sometimes as history, sometimes as fiction, sometimes as folklore. It became one of those stories that people told when they wanted to illustrate the complexity of moral judgment, the ways in which circumstances can transform victims into perpetrators, and love into something dangerous. In the 1980s, a team of archaeologists excavating the site of Bellmeyer uncovered the remains of a body buried in the south field, beneath what had once been an oak tree. The body was male, approximately 50 years old at the time of death, and there were signs of trauma consistent with a gunshot wound to the head. DNA analysis was not yet advanced enough to confirm the identity, but circumstantial evidence strongly suggested that the remains were those of Nathaniel Grayson. The discovery reignited interest in the case. Journalists wrote articles, historians gave interviews, and a documentary filmmaker produced a short film about Catherine and Elias, titled Bound by Silence. The film was shown at a few regional festivals and then largely forgotten. But the story persisted, because it touched something fundamental, something that people recognized even if they could not articulate it. The knowledge that the systems we live in shape the choices we make, and that sometimes survival requires acts that defy every moral boundary we have been taught to respect. In 2003, a genealogist tracing the descendants of orphans from Charleston stumbled upon a record that seemed to connect to Catherine's son. The record was incomplete, but it suggested that the boy had been adopted by a family in North Carolina and had taken their name. The genealogist attempted to follow the trail further, but eventually hit a dead end. The descendants, if they still existed, were unaware of their connection to Catherine and Elias, and perhaps it was better that way. The story belonged to the past, and the past, for all its weight, did not have to define the present. Today, the site of Bellmeyer is a state historical marker on a quiet road in the Carolina Lowcountry. The marker provides a brief summary of the property's history, mentioning that it was the site of a notable murder trial in 1857, but it does not go into detail about Catherine and Elias. Visitors who stop to read the marker sometimes ask locals about the story, and if they ask the right person, they might hear a version of it, though the details vary depending on who is telling it. Some versions emphasize Catherine's guilt, portraying her as a manipulative woman who seduced an innocent man into committing murder. Other versions emphasize her victimhood, portraying her as a woman trapped in an abusive marriage who saw no other way out. Still, other versions focus on Elias, casting him as either a hero who sacrificed himself for love or a tragic figure who was doomed from the start. The truth, as always, is more complicated than any single version can capture. Catherine and Elias were both victims and perpetrators, both heroes and criminals, both tragic and defiant. They lived in a world that gave them impossible choices, and they made the choice that seemed to offer the only possibility of survival. Whether that choice was right or wrong is a question that each person who hears the story must answer for themselves. What is certain is that their story has endured, that it continues to be told, and that it continues to provoke the same uncomfortable questions about love, power, and the boundaries of morality. This is not a story with a resolution. It is a story that lingers, that refuses to be neatly categorized or comfortably dismissed. It asks us to consider what we would do if we were trapped as Catherine and Elias were trapped, if every door was closed and every choice led to suffering. It asks us to consider the systems that create such traps, and the ways in which those systems persist, in different forms, into the present. The silence that surrounded Catherine and Elias during their lives has been broken by time, by historians, by novelists, by archaeologists. But in some ways, the silence remains. Their voices, their true thoughts and feelings, are lost. We have only the records they left behind, the testimonies of others, the fragments of a story that can never be fully reconstructed. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some stories are meant to be incomplete, to exist as questions rather than answers, to haunt us rather than comfort us. The story of Catherine and Elias is one of those stories. It is a story about the price of love in a world that forbids it, about the cost of survival in a system that denies humanity, about the terrible clarity that comes when there is no way forward except through violence. In the decades following Catherine's death, the memory of what happened at Belmire became a kind of ghost story in the Low Country. Old women would whisper about it to their granddaughters as a cautionary tale, though what exactly the caution was remained unclear. Was it a warning against forbidden love? Against defying one's husband? Against the dangers of crossing social boundaries? Or was it something else entirely? A recognition that sometimes the world creates situations so impossible that violence becomes the only language left. The ambiguity of the story's moral made it both fascinating and disturbing. It refused to offer the comfort of clear villainy or uncomplicated heroism. Nathaniel Grayson had been a cruel man, certainly, but did that justify his murder? Catherine had been trapped in an abusive marriage, but did that excuse conspiracy and killing? Elias had been enslaved, denied every basic human right, but did that make him innocent of the crime he committed? These questions had no easy answers, and perhaps that was why the story endured. It forced people to confront the uncomfortable truth that morality is not always simple, that circumstances can bend the rules we think are absolute, that sometimes there are no good choices, only choices that lead to different kinds of suffering. The legal system that tried and convicted Catherine and Elias had no room for such nuance. The law saw only the crime. A wife and her lover had conspired to murder her husband. The circumstances were irrelevant. The abuse Catherine had endured was considered a private matter, not a legal justification. Elias's status as an enslaved person only made his crime more heinous in the eyes of the court, a violation not just of law, but of the entire social order. The verdict had been predetermined by the society that created the court, and the sentences were as much about maintaining that society's power structure as they were about punishing individual wrongdoing. But outside the courtroom, in the quiet conversations that happened in kitchens and fields, in the whispered exchanges between people who understood what it meant to be powerless, the story took on different meanings. For enslaved people, Elias became a figure of tragic resistance, a man who had dared to love and to protect, who had struck back against a system that sought to destroy him. His execution was seen not as justice, but as the inevitable fate of anyone who challenged the order of things. For women trapped in their own marriages, women who endured violence and humiliation behind closed doors, Catherine became something between a monster and a martyr. She had done what many of them had fantasized about, but never dared attempt. She had freed herself, even if that freedom had lasted only months before the law caught up with her. Some women spoke of her with horror, others with a dark admiration they would never voice publicly. The story also became entangled with the larger narrative of the Civil War and its aftermath. Catherine and Elias's crime took place in 1857, just 4 years before the war began, at a time when the tensions that would eventually tear the nation apart were already visible to anyone paying attention. Their story, in some ways, foreshadowed the violence to come, a violence born of irreconcilable contradictions, of a society built on foundations that could not hold. When the war ended and slavery was abolished, some people looked back at cases like Catherine and Elias's and saw them differently. What had been viewed as a simple crime of passion or greed began to look more like a rebellion against an unjust system. Some abolitionists and social reformers cited the case as evidence of slavery's corrupting influence, arguing that it created conditions that drove people to desperate acts. Others used it to argue for reforms in marriage law, pointing out that women like Catherine had no legal recourse against abusive husbands, no way to escape except through flight or violence. But these reinterpretations came too late for Catherine and Elias. They were already dead, their fates sealed by the time the nation's moral compass began, however slowly and incompletely, to shift. The physical landscape where these events unfolded has changed dramatically over the years, but the emotional landscape remains somehow preserved, as if the land itself remembers what happened. Visitors to the site today often report a feeling of unease, a sense that they are being watched, that the air is heavier than it should be. Scientists would attribute this to suggestion, to the power of knowing the history of a place to color our perception of it. But those who believe in such things say that places where great suffering and great love have coincided become marked in ways we cannot fully explain. The ruins of Bellmeyer still stand, though barely. The main house collapsed completely in a storm in 1973, leaving only the foundation and a few stubborn wall sections. The barn where Catherine and Elias met, where they spoke in whispers and planned their impossible future, burned down in the 1920s, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some say it was lightning. Others claim it was deliberately set by someone who wanted to erase the last physical reminder of what had happened there. The slave cabins, including the one where Elias lived, rotted away gradually over the decades, returning to the earth from which they had been built. Nature has been thorough in reclaiming the property. Where there were once cotton fields, there is now dense underbrush and young forest. The irrigation ditches that Elias maintained have filled in, invisible beneath layers of leaves and soil. The road that led to the house has been overgrown, accessible now only on foot. The oak trees that lined that road, witnesses to everything that transpired, continue to grow, their branches reaching higher, their roots digging deeper, their Spanish moss hanging like mourning veils. In 2015, a graduate student in history at the College of Charleston completed a doctoral dissertation on Catherine and Elias's case. She had spent 3 years researching every available document, tracking down descendants of the jurors and witnesses, examining the legal framework that had made their conviction inevitable. Her dissertation, titled Transgressive Love and Legal Violence, Marriage, Slavery, and Murder in the Antebellum South, argued that Catherine and Elias should be understood not as criminals, but as victims of intersecting systems of oppression who had been forced into an impossible situation. The story remained what it had always been, a dark, troubling tale that resisted simple interpretation. The graduate student, whose name was Maya Robinson, became somewhat obsessed with Catherine and Elias during her research. She visited the site of Bellmeyer multiple times, walked the same ground they had walked, tried to imagine what their lives had been like. She read Catherine's testimony dozens of times, looking for clues to her emotional state, her thought process, her true feelings about what she had done. She studied the sparse records of Elias's life, piecing together a portrait of a man who had been denied the opportunity to tell his own story. In the acknowledgments section of her book, Robinson wrote, "This is a story about people who had no good options, who made choices that we might judge harshly from our comfortable distance, but who were simply trying to survive in a world that offered them no mercy. I do not ask readers to excuse what Catherine and Elias did, but I do ask that we try to understand it, and in understanding, perhaps to recognize the systems that created the conditions for such tragedies." Robinson's work brought renewed attention to the case, but it also sparked criticism from some quarters. Descendants of Nathaniel Grayson's family, still living in South Carolina, objected to what they saw as a sympathetic portrayal of his murderers. They had their own family stories about Nathaniel, passed down through generations, stories that painted him not as a monster, but as a complicated man shaped by his time, a man who had suffered his own losses and disappointments. The debate over how to remember and interpret the case continues to this day. It has become a kind of litmus test for how people think about justice, about moral responsibility, about the relationship between individual agency and social structure. Some see Catherine and Elias as murderers who deserve no sympathy. It reminds us that history is not just a collection of dates and facts, but a record of real people who lived and loved and suffered and made choices that echo across time. Today, if you visit the site of Belmire, you will find almost nothing left of the buildings. But you will find the land itself, the earth that holds within it the remains of Nathaniel Grayson, the memories of Catherine and Elias's stolen moments, the weight of everything that happened there. You will find the oak trees, still standing, still growing, their roots intertwined beneath the soil in ways that mirror the intertwined fates of the three people whose story took place in their shade. And if you listen carefully, if you allow yourself to be still and present, you might hear something. Not a voice exactly, but an echo of lost souls who loved and killed and died, and left behind a legacy that refuses to be forgotten. An echo that asks us to remember, to bear witness, to carry forward the truth that even in the darkest moments, even when the world offers no mercy, the human spirit finds ways to resist, to love, to hope. This is the story of Catherine and Elias. It is a story without a happy ending, without redemption, without the comfort of closure. It is a story that began in silence and returns to silence, but in between it speaks volumes about who we are and what we are capable of, both the worst and the best of human nature. And it is a story that will continue to be told as long as there are people willing to listen, willing to sit with discomfort, willing to acknowledge that sometimes love and violence are not opposites, but two sides of the same desperate coin. The echoes of their story will continue to reverberate through time, through the generations that come after, through the land itself, reminding us that the past is never truly past, that the souls we lose are never truly lost, and that the choices we make in our darkest moments define not just our own lives, but the lives of all who come after.